This is Austin's Animals, collecting all things furry, and today we're going to be looking at the McFarlane Toys Werewolf from Wetworks, or as I like to call him, One Long Boy. This werewolf figure is a McFarlane Toys classic, although he is not from Spawn. This is a werewolf from the comic Wetworks created by Will Sportatio. Wetworks follows a team of superpowered, shiny golden agents that battle vampires, werewolves, and other monsters. If that sounds like a great idea for a toy line, well, Todd McFarlane also thought so, and in 1994 created one of his first licensed action figure lines that wasn't Spawn. Alongside the sleek and shiny gold figures, we got the werewolf. This is the brown version of the werewolf, although today I'll be reviewing the gray variant that was released. These wolves are not supposed to be any particular character, but rather just baddies that you can kind of troop build and generic goons for your Wetworks agents to fight. On the back of the card here, we get a look at all the other figures that were available in this line, and I'll be honest, I had never heard of this toy line before until I was recommended this wolf figure. Obviously the wolf figure is going to be of interest to this channel, as we collect anthropomorphic animal figures, but I will say the other action figures in this line look quite awesome. I love shiny and metallic figures, single color figures as well, and I like that they're all shiny and golden. I think that's cool. I even saw that in the comic book there's a golden werewolf, and I think a gold cast of this figure would have looked awesome had the line continued. Unfortunately, Wetworks was a very short-lived comic, and the toy line itself was pretty short-lived too. We get a short bio of the character that reads, "A creature of the night tribes, werewolves have lived among mankind for millennia. Prone to berserk rages, werewolves guard against their violent natures, lest their presence is revealed to mankind and they are destroyed. They must hunt their ancient enemies, the vampires, and will not rest until all of them are gone." Here's one last look at the vintage packaging before we crack this sucker open. I mean, toys are meant to be played with. How many of these McFarlane figures were kept in the package anyway? Here's our boy. What an absolute unit. So Articulation is about what you'd expect for an early 90s McFarlane figure. No ball joints, nothing super impressive, although we do have these nice arm hinges. Still, the pin is pretty visible on the side there, and it kind of hinders the sculpt, but I guess it's better than him just having, the basic 5 POA. This figure has some unusual joints, like that head that can only kind of ratchet up and down, it can't look side to side, and then the paws that swivel, and those are part of a kind of an action feature I'll talk about in a minute. Now the legs themselves are really nice, they had no trouble rotating, and despite being in package for so long, this figure didn't have any stiff joints, everything just moved really nicely. Oh, and we've got a 360 rotating tail, that's always a nice touch, although the tail has trouble moving around because of the legs, because his legs are so big, you kind of have to move them to get the tail to move. As for the sculpt, it is phenomenal, like most McFarlane figures of the time. This werewolf looks like the one from Wetworks, but it definitely takes some of McFarlane's creative liberties. Okay, so he's got the Wetworks style where he's got a really skinny body and big broad shoulders, kind of that 90s super muscly look, but he's also got some McFarlane design, like the asymmetry and the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The bandages and the blood and kind of the grittiness of it all. It's not a very clean looking figure, and his legs are kind of in different positions. We also have the strange inclusion of this accessory. I couldn't find any information on what it's supposed to be or if it's even featured in the comic, and it doesn't fit his hands because his hands are kind of these solid paws that have no grip. So the only thing you can do with this is kind of slip it in the back on this rubber holster he has. I don't know why this wasn't just sculpted onto the character and why it's a separate piece instead. Still, it's pretty cool, and I guess I could always use it with some of my other figures. Still, I can't gush enough about how great this sculpt is. There was nothing else like this at the time this figure came out. It was truly groundbreaking, and was probably like the most amazing werewolf ever. Plus, I just love his kind of goofy design, with the skinny tummy and the wide hips and the little head. He's just so goofy looking and interesting that he stands out with all of my other animal figures. Like, yeah, you could say the proportions are kind of ridiculous, but I think it makes him unique. Speaking of unique, this werewolf has a transforming feature. Yes, he can go from wolf to wolfman? Okay, so he can get on his hind legs and basically become a more feral wolf, which again might explain some of the goofy sculpt, since he has to look believable as both an anthropomorphic werewolf and as one on his hind legs like an animal. And this form looks pretty good too. Also, let's talk about that tail. It's cloth hair. I don't think I've ever seen a rooted tail on a boy's action figure before. Pretty interesting, but it definitely makes the figure more believable and adds to the quality. Plus that back piece accessory does look pretty nice when he's in wolf mode. Maybe that's the reason they made it. Why it's not, sculpted on the figure, because it does look quality. This is definitely a premium figure for the time, and heck, even looks better than most action figures today. The Wetworks Wolf isn't the only transforming animal figure, as years later, in the underrated Z-Bars line, we would get Razorclaw, a panther figure that can also go from kind of a werewolf form to a more feral animal form. This was done years later, and the execution is a bit cleaner. For instance, the figure simply just looks more stylistically appealing in both feral and anthropomorphic form. But given this figure's minimalist design, that's a given. Still, it's an interesting comparison, and I have no doubt in my mind that the design of this figure, Razorclaw, was based upon the Wetworks Werewolf, and shows just how much influence Todd McFarlane can have on the toy industry. I think it's a good figure, and the transforming is easy, fun, and looks good in both forms. I have nothing to complain here. This is a figure great both in form and function. He looks great displayed in both modes, so let's have some fun photography to cap it off. Photographing this chunky boy was a lot of fun, although I gotta be real with you guys, being a bit of a wolf myself, these are some unrealistic expectations for men. How am I supposed to measure up to this absolute unit?